close your eyes and let your mind drift across the vast expanse of the Eurasian plain, where endless forests of silver birch stretch beyond the horizon like a sea of whispered secrets. Here, where winter nights last for months and summer days seem to never end, time moves differently than in our hurried world. The wind carries stories across these steppes, stories of a civilization that grew from humble river settlements to become the largest contiguous empire in human history, spanning 11 time zones and touching 3 continents. Tonight, we journey together through centuries of triumph and tragedy, of golden domes rising against snowy landscapes, of ordinary people whose dreams and struggles shaped the destiny of nations. This is not merely a tale of conquest and collapse, but a meditation on how human societies grow, flourish, and transform across the great cycles of history. Let the gentle rhythm of this story carry you like a river flowing toward the sea, past the concerns of our present moment, into a realm where empires rise and fall like seasons changing across the endless Russian plain. Here, in this timeless landscape, we begin with the earliest whispers of a people who would call themselves the Rus. In the misty decades of the 9th century, when Western Europe struggled through the dark aftermath of Charlemagne's fractured empire, something extraordinary was stirring along the great river routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Picture, if you will, the morning mist rising from the Volkhov River near what would become Novgorod, where Slavic fishermen hauled in their nets as they had for countless generations, unaware that their world was about to transform forever. The ancient chronicle of bygone years, that remarkable document penned by monkish scribes centuries later, tells us that in the year 862, the Slavic and Finnish tribes of this region made a decision that would echo through history. Exhausted by internal warfare and seeking stability, they sent messengers across the Baltic Sea with a peculiar invitation. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. This legendary calling of the Varangians, those Norse traders and warriors who had been plying the river routes for generations, marks not conquest but invitation, not subjugation but synthesis. Rurik, the semi-mythical prince who answered this call, established himself at Novgorod with a governance that blended Scandinavian military organization with Slavic customs of consultation and consent. Imagine yourself as a merchant in those early days, your boat heavy with amber from the Baltic shores, furs from the northern forests, and honey from the endless meadows. The rivers were your highways, connecting you to Constantinople's golden markets in the south and the silver mines of the Islamic world beyond. You would have witnessed the gradual emergence of something unprecedented, a civilization that was neither purely Scandinavian nor Slavic, but something entirely new. The archaeological evidence speaks as eloquently as the chronicles. In the burial mounds scattered across this landscape, Swedish swords rest beside Slavic pottery, Byzantine coins mingle with Islamic silver, and Norse Thor's hammers lie near Slavic fertility amulets. These graves tell us of a society in fluid transformation, where cultural boundaries were more porous than political maps might suggest. As Rurik's successors, Oleg, Igor, and the formidable Olga, extended their influence southward along the Dnieper River, they carried with them not just military ambition, but the accumulated wisdom of northern governance. Kiev, that mother of Russian cities, became their southern capital, a glittering entrepot where northern furs met southern silks, where pagan traditions encountered Christian theology, where the practical democracy of Novgorod's Veshe assemblies contrasted with the emerging autocracy of princely courts. The daily rhythms of life in these early settlements, moved to the ancient cadences of agricultural seasons and commercial cycles. In summer, when the rivers ran free and the white nights of the north gave way to the productive warmth of harvest time, traders launched their expeditions toward Byzantium. Winter brought the long season of craftsmanship, when smiths forged weapons and tools by firelight, when women wove the intricate textiles that would become currency in distant markets, when storytellers preserved the oral traditions that would eventually flower into written literature. Yet beneath this emerging prosperity lay tensions that would define Russian civilization for centuries to come. The democratic traditions of Novgorod, where citizens gathered in popular assemblies to debate policy and elect officials, stood in stark contrast to the monarchical principles taking root in Kiev. This fundamental tension between participatory and autocratic governance, between the communal traditions of the Slavic village and the hierarchical structures of princely courts, would resurface again and again throughout Russian history. The Rus were becoming something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a people who belonged neither to the Latin West nor to the Byzantine East, yet participated fully in both worlds. Their merchants were welcomed in Constantinople's great markets, their warriors served as the Byzantine emperor's elite guard, their princes married into the royal houses of both Western and Eastern Europe. Yet they remained distinctly themselves, developing their own synthesis of cultural elements that would eventually flower into a unique civilization. As the 10th century drew to a close, this remarkable experiment in cultural fusion faced its most momentous decision. The great Prince Vladimir of Kiev stood at a crossroads that would determine not just his own fate, but the spiritual destiny of his people for centuries to come. The stage was set for a transformation that would dwarf even the remarkable synthesis that had created the Rus themselves. In the closing years of the 10th century, as the first millennium of the Christian era approached its end, Prince Vladimir of Kiev found himself confronting a decision that would resonate through history like the deep tolling of cathedral bells. The polytheistic traditions that had sustained his ancestors, the worship of Perun, the thunder god, of Velez, the protector of cattle, of the household spirits that dwelt in every peasant cottage, could no longer unite the diverse peoples gathering under his rule. The legendary account of Vladimir's deliberations, preserved in the primary chronicle, reads like a spiritual odyssey that encapsulates the medieval world's great religious crossroads. Picture the prince in his wooden palace overlooking the Dnieper, as envoys from the Islamic world described the scholarly traditions of Baghdad and Cordova, their voices painting visions of architectural marvels and mathematical discoveries that had preserved the wisdom of antiquity. Yet when they spoke of prohibitions against wine, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus," Vladimir reportedly replied. Jewish Khazars, those remarkable people who had built a commercial empire between the Caspian and Black Seas, sent their own ambassadors. Their theological arguments were sophisticated, their commercial networks impressive, yet their recent political defeats raised questions about divine favor that medieval minds could not ignore. Western Catholic emissaries arrived with promises of alliance with the great powers of Europe, yet their insistence on papal supremacy conflicted with the princely autonomy that Vladimir prized. But when the Byzantine envoys spoke of the Orthodox faith, describing the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia with its seemingly weightless dome floating above forests of marble columns, something stirred in the northern prince's imagination. His own ambassadors, returning from Constantinople, could barely find words for what they had witnessed. "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth," they reported, "for on earth there is no such splendor or beauty." The decision, when it came in 988, was characteristically dramatic. Vladimir ordered the destruction of Perun's idol, commanding that it be dragged through the streets of Kiev before being cast into the Dnieper. Yet this apparent iconoclasm masked a more subtle transformation. The ancient oak groves, where Slavs had worshipped their nature spirits, became sites for wooden churches, their forest sanctity preserved within Christian theology. The agricultural festivals that had marked seasonal transitions were gently transformed into Christian feast days, their essential rhythms unchanged. The mass baptism of Kiev's population in the Dnieper River became one of history's great symbolic moments. Imagine standing on the riverbank that summer morning, watching as thousands waded into the flowing water, while Byzantine priests chanted in Greek and Old Church Slavonic. Children splashed and played, treating the ceremony as a great festival, while their elders stood solemnly, sensing that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. The water that had carried their trade goods to Constantinople now carried their prayers to heaven, yet the transformation extended far beyond ritual observance. With Christianity came literacy, as the Cyrillic alphabet, that remarkable adaptation of Greek letters to Slavic sounds, spread throughout the Rus lands. Monasteries became centers, not just of prayer, but of learning, where monks painstakingly copied manuscripts that preserved both theological wisdom and practical knowledge. The first libraries emerged, the first schools, the first systematic attempts to record the customs and laws that had previously existed only in oral tradition. The artistic transformation was equally profound. Byzantine masters arrived to teach local craftsmen the techniques of icon painting, mosaic work, and architectural engineering. The wooden fortress churches of the early period gave way to stone cathedrals that seemed to capture heaven's light within their walls. The Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, begun during Vladimir's reign, represented a synthesis of Byzantine theological concepts with northern building techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. Daily life, too, felt the gentle pressure of Christian transformation. Marriage customs evolved from bride purchase to sacramental ceremony, though ancient traditions of dowry and family negotiation persisted within Christian forms. Burial practices shifted from cremation to interment, yet the old customs of placing grave goods with the deceased continued in Christian guise. The agricultural calendar retained its seasonal rhythms while acquiring new spiritual significance through the liturgical year. Perhaps most significantly, Christianity provided the cultural adhesive that could bind together the diverse peoples gathering under Rus rule. Slavs, Finns, Balts, and scattered Scandinavian settlers found common identity not in ethnic origin, but in shared faith. The Orthodox liturgy, conducted in Slavonic rather than Latin, meant that Christianity took root in vernacular culture rather than remaining the province of learned elites. This religious transformation established patterns that would endure for centuries. The close relationship between church and state, the synthesis of Byzantine theological traditions with local customs, the tension between monastic ideals and worldly necessities, the complex relationship with both Western Europe and the Islamic world all emerged during this foundational period. As the 11th century dawned, the Rus had become something unique in medieval Eurasia. A Christian civilization that was neither Western nor purely Byzantine, a society that preserved ancient democratic traditions within emerging monarchical structures, a people whose rivers connected them to the great commercial networks of 3 continents. They were ready to enter their golden age. The 11th and 12th centuries unfolded like a magnificent tapestry across the Rus lands, each principality contributing its own distinctive thread to a pattern of remarkable cultural flowering. From the merchant republic of Novgorod in the north, where citizens gathered in raucous assemblies to debate policy and elect their officials, to the princely courts of Vladimir Suzdal, where architects were raising white stone cathedrals that seemed to float above the forest landscape like prayers made visible. Russian civilization entered its first great age of creative synthesis. Picture, if you will, a morning in 12th century Kiev, that mother of Russian cities that contemporaries called the rival of Constantinople itself. The golden domes of St. Sophia catch the early sunlight as merchants from Byzantium, the Islamic lands, and Western Europe converge in the great marketplace beside the Dnieper. The air fills with a symphony of languages: Greek and Arabic, Latin and Hebrew, the various Slavic dialects that are slowly coalescing into what will become literary Russian. Amber from the Baltic mingles with Chinese silks that have traveled the entire length of the Eurasian steppe, while local craftsmen display jewelry whose intricate patterns blend Scandinavian geometric designs with Byzantine religious symbolism. In the scriptorium of the Monastery of the Caves, that remarkable complex tunneled into the bluffs above the river, monks labor by candlelight to copy manuscripts that will preserve both theological wisdom and secular learning. Here, the primary chronicle takes shape under the patient pen of Nestor, weaving together oral traditions, Byzantine historical models, and personal observation into the first systematic account of Russian origins. These monastic libraries become the repositories of accumulated wisdom, where Aristotelian philosophy encountered Slavic folk wisdom, where Byzantine theology engaged with practical questions of governance and law. The artistic achievements of this period still inspire wonder. In Novgorod, the Cathedral of St. Central, Sophia rises with a distinctly northern interpretation of Byzantine architectural principles, its massive walls and smaller windows adapted to harsh winter conditions, yet its interior spaces soar with ethereal lightness. Local painters developed their own iconographic traditions, their faces of saints and angels reflecting Slavic rather than Mediterranean features, their color palettes drawn from the northern landscape of silver birch and deep pine forests. Yet perhaps the most remarkable achievement of this golden age was not architectural or artistic, but social and political. The Rus developed a unique system of governance that balanced princely authority with popular consultation, autocratic efficiency with democratic participation. In Novgorod, the Verkhy Assembly continued to function as a genuine popular parliament, where citizens could debate foreign policy, elect officials, and even depose unsatisfactory princes. "If the prince is no good," ran a contemporary saying, "into the mud with him." This democratic tradition coexisted with the emerging autocracy of Vladimir Suzdal, where Prince Yuri Dolgoruki and his successors were developing the administrative and military innovations that would eventually create the Muscovite state. The tension between these competing models of governance reflected deeper questions about Russian identity that would persist for centuries. Should authority flow upward from popular consultation or downward from divine mandate? Could the individualistic traditions of the forest-dwelling Slavs be reconciled with the collective discipline required for managing a vast, multi-ethnic empire? Daily life in these medieval principalities moved to rhythms that connected earthly labors with cosmic purposes. The agricultural calendar, still fundamental to an economy based on grain cultivation and forest exploitation, acquired new spiritual dimensions through the Orthodox liturgical year. Spring planting ceremonies blended ancient fertility rituals with Christian prayers for divine blessing, while autumn harvest festivals thanked both pagan earth spirits and the Christian God for nature's bounty. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds that served simultaneously as economic institutions, social communities, and religious brotherhoods. The smiths of Novgorod, whose steel was prized from Greenland to Constantinople, maintained workshops that were also shrines, where the techniques of metalworking were transmitted alongside prayers and moral instruction. Their masterpieces, swords whose blades bore inscriptions in Cyrillic script, jewelry that incorporated both Christian crosses and pre-Christian solar symbols, represented a synthesis of practical skill with spiritual purpose. Literature began to flower in forms that captured the distinctive spirit of Rus civilization. The tale of Igor's campaign, that remarkable epic poem describing a disastrous military expedition against the Polovotzian nomads, reveals a culture where heroic ideals coexisted with political wisdom, where individual honor was balanced against collective welfare. Its anonymous author displays familiarity with both classical learning and folk traditions, creating a work that speaks simultaneously to princes and peasants, to the learned and the unlettered. Women played more prominent roles in this society than in most medieval civilizations. Princess Olga's regency had established precedents for female political leadership, while the Orthodox tradition of married clergy meant that women participated actively in religious life. The birch-bark letters discovered by archaeologists in Novgorod reveal a society where women engaged in commerce, corresponded with distant relatives, and participated in the cultural life of their communities with remarkable freedom. The military culture that emerged during this period reflected the unique challenges of forest and steppe warfare. Russian warriors developed tactical innovations that blended Scandinavian infantry traditions with the mounted warfare learned from nomadic neighbors. Their fortified cities, constructed with sophisticated understanding of siege warfare, were designed to withstand the seasonal raids that came from the steppes like clockwork each summer. Yet beneath this cultural flowering lay gathering storms. The fragmentation of the Rus lands into competing principalities, each jealously guarding its prerogatives, created vulnerabilities that external enemies would eventually exploit. The democratic traditions of Novgorod and the autocratic innovations of Vladimir Suzdal represented incompatible visions of Russian development that would require external pressure to resolve. As the 12th century waned, strange reports reached the Rus lands from the east. Nomadic peoples spoke of vast armies moving across the Asian steppes, led by a conqueror whose very name struck terror into the hearts of settled peoples. The Golden Age was drawing toward its close, though few could have imagined the magnitude of the storm approaching from the Mongolian heartland. The winter of 1237 arrived with unusual severity across the Rus lands, as if nature itself was preparing the stage for catastrophe. In the forests around Moscow, that insignificant trading post on the Moskva River, the snow fell deeper than anyone could remember, muffling sound and transforming the familiar landscape into an alien wilderness of white silence. It was through this frozen world that Batu Khan's Mongol armies advanced like a force of nature itself, their thousands of horsemen moving with a discipline and coordination that no European army had ever achieved. Imagine yourself as a sentinel on the walls of Ryazan, that prosperous principality that had the misfortune to lie directly in the Mongols' path. For days, you would have watched the horizon for signs of the approaching storm, seeing first the distant smoke plumes from burning villages, then the scattered refugees fleeing with their few portable possessions. Finally, the dark mass of the Mongol army itself, spreading across the white landscape like spilled ink. The sound would reach you before the sight, the thunder of countless hoofbeats, the creaking of siege engines, the alien music of Mongol war songs carried on the winter wind. The siege of Ryazan completed in just 5 days, established patterns that would be repeated across the Rus lands. The Mongol military machine represented something unprecedented in European experience, a perfectly coordinated instrument of destruction that combined the mobility of nomadic cavalry with sophisticated siege techniques learned from Chinese engineers. Their ultimatum was simple: submission and tribute, or complete annihilation. When Ryazan's Prince Yuri refused, the city's fate was sealed. Yet what strikes the modern observer is not merely the efficiency of Mongol conquest, but the remarkable adaptation that followed. The traditional narrative of the Mongol yoke as a period of unrelieved suffering and cultural stagnation obscures a more complex reality. The Mongols, those pragmatic inheritors of Genghis Khan's political genius, proved to be administrators as skilled as they were warriors. They did not seek to replace Russian civilization, but to extract tribute from it as efficiently as possible. Prince Yaroslav of Vladimir, one of the first Rus leaders to submit to Mongol authority, discovered that collaboration could be more profitable than resistance. The Mongol administrative system, with its decimal organization and systematic record-keeping, actually improved upon the chaotic feudal arrangements that had characterized the late Kievan period. Tribute collection, while burdensome, was at least predictable, unlike the random devastation of princely warfare that had plagued the land for generations. In the churches and monasteries, where Russian culture preserved itself during these difficult centuries, scribes continued their patient work of copying manuscripts and recording chronicles. The Orthodox clergy, granted religious autonomy by the pragmatically tolerant Mongols, found themselves in the paradoxical position of flourishing under pagan rule. The great monasteries, Holy Trinity near Moscow, the Monastery of the Caves in Kiev, became islands of learning where theological scholarship continued to develop, often incorporating influences from the broader Eurasian cultural synthesis that Mongol rule had created. Daily life for ordinary Russians adapted to the new realities with the resilience that had sustained Slavic communities through previous centuries of conflict and uncertainty. Peasant families continued to plant their grain and tend their livestock, though now a portion of their harvest disappeared into the Mongol tribute system. Craftsmen found new markets for their skills as Mongol administrators demanded Russian metalwork, wood carving, and textile production for export across the vast Eurasian trade networks that connected China to the Mediterranean. The city that would ultimately benefit most from this period of apparent subjugation was Moscow, that insignificant settlement that seemed destined for permanent obscurity. Yet Moscow's princes, beginning with the shrewd Daniel Alexandrovich, understood something that their more prestigious rivals in Tver and Vladimir failed to grasp. The Mongol system created opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. Ivan Kalita, whose nickname Moneybags reflected his reputation for reliable tribute collection, transformed Moscow's political insignificance into administrative importance. By serving as the Khan's chief tribute collector for the Russian lands, he gained access to resources that he systematically reinvested in territorial expansion, military development, and cultural patronage. His partnership with Metropolitan Peter, who moved the ecclesiastical capital from Vladimir to Moscow, created a powerful alliance between secular and spiritual authority that would define Russian political culture for centuries. The gradual accumulation of Moscow's power occurred through patient exploitation of Mongol administrative structures rather than dramatic military conquest. Each generation of Moscow princes added territories through purchase, inheritance, and strategic marriage, always careful to maintain their privileged relationship with the Golden Horde. They understood that the Mongol system, for all its foreign origins, had created unprecedented opportunities for centralization and expansion. Cultural synthesis during this period produced remarkable innovations. Russian military organization adopted Mongol cavalry tactics and command structures, creating hybrid forces that combined the mobility of steppe warfare with the defensive capabilities of forest fighters. Architectural styles incorporated Eastern influences, most visibly in the onion domes that began to replace the purely Byzantine cupolas of earlier periods. Even cuisine reflected this cultural mixing, as Asian spices and cooking techniques enriched the traditional Russian diet. The Mongol period also witnessed the emergence of distinctive Russian approaches to diplomacy and statecraft. Unlike Western European feudalism, which was based on personal loyalty relationships, the Mongol system taught Russian princes to think in terms of administrative efficiency and systematic resource extraction. The skills acquired through collaboration with Mongol administrators, record-keeping, territorial organization, tribute collection, would prove invaluable when Russians eventually assumed control of these systems themselves. Religious thought during this period developed along uniquely Russian lines, as Orthodox theologians grappled with questions of divine providence and national suffering. The tale of the destruction of Ryazan and similar works explored how faithful Christians should respond to conquest by pagans, ultimately developing a theology of redemptive suffering that would deeply influence Russian spiritual culture. Monasticism flourished as believers sought spiritual alternatives to political powerlessness. Yet these monastic communities also preserved the learning and cultural traditions that would enable eventual national revival. By the 14th century, the balance of power was beginning to shift. The Golden Horde itself was fragmenting into competing khanates, while Moscow's patient accumulation of resources and territories had created a power base that could challenge Mongol supremacy. The great test would come when Moscow's princes decided that the tribute system had outlived its usefulness, and that the time had arrived to transform themselves from Mongol vassals into Mongol conquerors. In the quiet chambers of the Moscow Kremlin during the winter of 1462, as snow fell softly outside the wooden walls that would soon be replaced by Italian-designed stone fortifications, a 22-year-old prince named Ivan prepared to inherit a realm that existed more in potential than in reality. The various Russian principalities remained scattered across the northern forests like beads from a broken necklace, each guarding its ancient privileges, each maintaining its own relationship with the increasingly weakened Golden Horde. Yet this young man, who would become known to history as Ivan the Great, possessed a vision of unity that would transform the political landscape of Eastern Europe. The genius of Ivan III lay not in dramatic military conquest, though he proved himself a capable general when necessary, but in his patient understanding of how power accumulates across generations. Like a master craftsman assembling a complex mechanism, he approached the gathering of Russian lands as a systematic process that combined diplomatic marriage, economic pressure, strategic patience, and just enough military force to convince stubborn holdouts that resistance was futile. Novgorod, that ancient republic whose democratic traditions stretched back to the dawn of Russian history, presented the most complex challenge. Picture the great bell that had summoned citizens to their vetch assemblies for over 4 centuries, its bronze voice calling free men to debate the policies of their city-state. The Novgorodians treasured their independence with the fierce pride of merchants who had grown wealthy through their own enterprise, their city-state controlling vast territories that stretched to the Arctic Ocean and across the Urals into Siberia. Yet Novgorod's very success had created vulnerabilities that Moscow's patient strategy could exploit. The city's wealth depended on trade routes that increasingly passed through Moscow's territories, while its democratic institutions struggled to provide the unified leadership necessary for competing with centralized monarchies. When factions within Novgorod began negotiating with Lithuania for protection against Moscow's growing pressure, Ivan possessed the justification he needed for decisive action. The campaign of 1471 unfolded like a carefully choreographed drama. Ivan's armies moved through the Novgorodian territories with restraint, accepting submissions from towns that surrendered while treating prisoners with unusual clemency. The decisive battle at Shelon River became less a military clash than a demonstration of Moscow's overwhelming advantages in organization, discipline, and unified command. When Novgorod's citizen soldiers faced Ivan's professional troops, the limitations of democratic military organization became painfully apparent. Yet even in victory, Ivan demonstrated the political wisdom that distinguished him from mere conquerors. Rather than abolishing Novgorod's institutions entirely, he preserved their forms while transferring their substance to Moscow. The Vech bell was removed to Moscow, a symbolic gesture that resonated throughout the Russian lands. But local administration continued under the supervision of Ivan's appointed governors. Novgorod's merchant families were relocated to other cities, their properties redistributed to Moscow's service nobility, yet their commercial expertise was preserved and channeled toward imperial purposes. The annexation of Tver, that ancient rival of Moscow whose princes had once seemed destined to unite the Russian lands themselves, followed similar patterns of patient pressure and inevitable submission. Through strategic marriages, economic blockades, and diplomatic isolation, Ivan gradually surrounded Tver with Moscow's allies and dependencies until resistance became impossible. When the last prince of Tver fled to Lithuania, his city opened its gates without a siege. Each successful annexation strengthened Ivan's position for the next challenge. The service nobility that emerged from these conquests, men who owed their lands and status directly to the Grand Prince rather than to ancient hereditary rights, provided a reliable foundation for centralized authority. Unlike the independent boyars of earlier periods, these new nobles understood that their prosperity depended entirely on royal favor, creating incentives for loyalty that previous Russian rulers had never enjoyed. The transformation of Moscow itself during Ivan's reign symbolized the broader changes occurring throughout his expanding realm. The wooden fortress that had protected the city for generations gave way to magnificent brick walls designed by Italian architects who brought Renaissance engineering techniques to Russian construction. The Cathedral of the Assumption, built by the Italian master Aristotele Fioravanti, synthesized Byzantine religious traditions with Renaissance architectural innovation, creating a uniquely Russian interpretation of imperial grandeur. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation of Ivan's reign occurred not through conquest, but through a quiet diplomatic revolution that finally severed Russia's subordination to the Golden Horde. The famous Standing on the Ugra River in 1480 became one of history's most anticlimactic yet consequential confrontations. For weeks, Ivan's armies faced the forces of Khan Akhmat across the autumn waters, neither side willing to initiate the battle that might determine Russia's future. As winter approached and supply difficulties mounted, both armies gradually withdrew, leaving the question of supremacy unresolved yet somehow answered. The Mongol tribute system, which had sustained the Golden Horde for over 2 centuries, simply faded away through mutual neglect rather than dramatic repudiation. Ivan continued to pay symbolic tribute when convenient, while ignoring Mongol demands when they conflicted with Russian interests. The Khan's authority, unsupported by effective military power, became increasingly irrelevant to the practical realities of Eastern European politics. This quiet revolution established precedents that would influence Russian statecraft for centuries. Rather than openly challenging established authorities, Ivan preferred to allow them to collapse through their own internal contradictions while positioning Moscow to inherit their functions. The patience to wait for optimal conditions, the ability to exploit enemies' weaknesses without creating unnecessary conflicts, the skill to transform temporary advantages into permanent gains. These became hallmarks of Muscovite diplomatic tradition. The cultural implications of Ivan's gathering of Russian lands extended far beyond political unification. The various regional traditions, dialects, and customs that had developed during the period of fragmentation began to synthesize into a more unified Russian civilization. The Church, which had maintained cultural continuity during the darkest periods of division, now served as an instrument of integration, spreading standardized liturgical practices and literary traditions throughout Ivan's expanding territories. By the end of Ivan's reign in 5005, the political map of Eastern Europe had been fundamentally redrawn. Where once dozens of independent principalities had maintained precarious autonomy, a unified Russian state now controlled territories stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the steppe frontier. The patient work of gathering Russian lands had created something unprecedented, a centralized monarchy that combined the administrative efficiency of the Mongol system with the cultural coherence of Orthodox Christianity and the democratic traditions of the Slavic village community. Yet this remarkable achievement came at a cost that would influence Russian development for centuries. The destruction of regional autonomy, the subordination of ancient noble families to service obligations, the transformation of free cities into administrative units. These changes created a more efficient state, but a less diverse society. The creative tensions that had produced the cultural flowering of the Kievan period gave way to the imposed unity of autocratic rule. As Ivan's successors inherited this powerful but fragile creation, they would face the challenge of preserving unity while accommodating the natural human desires for participation, dignity, and local autonomy that no amount of administrative efficiency could entirely suppress. In the winter chambers of the Moscow Kremlin, as 1547 dawned cold and brilliant across the snow-covered city, a 16-year-old prince prepared for a coronation that would transform not only his own destiny, but the very nature of Russian political culture. Ivan Vasilievich, soon to be known to history by the fearsome epithet, the Terrible. Though the Russian word Grozny suggests awe-inspiring majesty rather than mere cruelty, stood at the threshold between medieval princedom and modern empire. Between the patient accumulation of his grandfather's reign and the explosive expansion that would carry Russian power across Eurasia. The coronation itself, conducted in the Cathedral of the Assumption within the Kremlin's walls, established precedents that would endure for centuries. For the first time in Russian history, a ruler claimed the title not of Grand Prince, but of Tsar Caesar, explicitly linking Moscow's authority to the imperial traditions of both Rome and Byzantium. The ceremony borrowed Byzantine rituals, Orthodox theology, and Mongol concepts of universal sovereignty to create something unprecedented, a specifically Russian interpretation of absolute monarchy that would influence political development from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific. Yet the young Ivan who emerged from this magnificent ceremony was a ruler shaped by trauma as much as by tradition. Orphaned at 8 and raised amid the violent feuding of boyar factions, he had learned early that power in Russia flowed not through legal institutions, but through personal relationships backed by the threat of violence. The boyar regency that controlled his minority had provided a harsh education in the realities of aristocratic politics, where ancient families pursued their feuds with complete disregard for the welfare of realm or ruler. The early years of Ivan's personal rule, however, revealed a different side of his complex character. Surrounded by advisors who would later be remembered as the Chosen Council, men like the priest Sylvester and the courtier Alexei Adashev, the young Tsar embarked on a remarkable program of legal, administrative, and military reform that transformed Russian government from medieval improvisation into early modern systematization. The Great Law Code promulgated in 1550, known as the Sudebnik, represents one of the earliest attempts to create uniform legal standards across the diverse territories that comprised the Russian state. Picture scribes in monastery scriptoriums across the realm laboriously copying these regulations, which addressed everything from criminal penalties to commercial disputes, from military service obligations to peasant mobility rights. For the first time, Russian subjects could know with reasonable certainty what their legal obligations were, regardless of local custom or aristocratic whim. Military reform during this period created the foundations for the professional army that would carry Russian power across continents. The new service regulations required nobles to provide military service in proportion to their landholdings, while the establishment of the Streltsy professional musketeers recruited from urban populations provided the Tsar with military forces that owed loyalty to the crown rather than to regional magnates. Artillery foundries established in Moscow began producing cannons that rivaled the best European ordnance, while military engineers adapted Western fortress design to Russian conditions. The conquest of Kazan in 5052 marked the first great triumph of these reformed institutions. The Tatar Khanate that had terrorized Russian settlements for generations fell to a campaign that demonstrated the new efficiency of centralized military organization. Picture the moment when Russian cannons finally breached Kazan's walls, as Orthodox priests chanted Te Deums, while Ivan's soldiers poured through the gaps, avenging centuries of raids and tribute payments. The great mosque of Kazan was transformed into an Orthodox cathedral, while Tatar nobles who submitted were incorporated into Russian service hierarchies with their ranks and properties largely intact. The fall of Astrakhan 4 years later completed Russian control of the Volga River system, opening the entire Caspian basin to Russian expansion, while severing the last connections between the Ottoman Empire and the Siberian Khanates. Merchants from Moscow could now trade directly with Persia and Central Asia, while Cossack adventurers began their epic journey across Siberia that would eventually carry the Russian flag to the Pacific Ocean. Yet these remarkable achievements coincided with the emergence of the psychological instabilities and political obsessions that would darken Ivan's later reign. The death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560, followed by military setbacks in the disastrous Livonian War, triggered paranoid suspicions that would ultimately consume both the Tsar and his realm. The dissolution of the Chosen Council and the exile or execution of his most capable advisors marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would traumatize Russian political culture for generations. The establishment of the Oprichnina in 1565 represented perhaps the most radical experiment in political organization ever attempted by a European monarch. Picture the realm divided into two parts: the Zemshina, governed through traditional institutions by hereditary nobles, and the Oprichnina, controlled directly by the Tsar through his black-robed agents who owed allegiance only to royal will. This bizarre parallel government, with its own territories, its own army, and its own administrative apparatus, enabled Ivan to wage systematic war against the very nobility that had brought him to power. The Oprichniki, those sinister figures who rode with dogs' heads and brooms attached to their saddles, symbols of their mission to hunt down and sweep away the Tsar's enemies, became instruments of state terror on a scale unprecedented in Russian history. Ancient boyar families that traced their lineages to Rurik himself found their patriarchs dragged from their estates to face torture and execution on charges of treason that no evidence could support. The city of Novgorod, suspected of negotiating with Lithuania, suffered a massacre that left thousands dead and destroyed the last vestiges of the democratic traditions that had once made it the envy of medieval Europe. Yet even during these dark years, Ivan's reign continued to produce remarkable cultural and institutional innovations. The first printing press in Russia appeared in Moscow during the 1560s, making books available to wider populations than ever before, and spreading literacy beyond monastic and aristocratic circles. The great cathedral of St. Basil the Blessed, constructed to commemorate the conquest of Kazan, rose beside Red Square like a fantastic vision of domes and colours that seemed to capture both the triumph and the madness of Ivan's reign. The Tsar himself, despite his increasing paranoia and violence, remained a remarkably learned man, whose correspondence with European monarchs revealed sophisticated understanding of theology, history, and political theory. His famous exchange of letters with Prince Andrei Kurbsky, the boyar general who fled to Lithuania rather than face Ivan's suspicions, provides one of the most articulate defenses of absolute monarchy ever written by a reigning sovereign. Ivan argued that God had entrusted him with the spiritual welfare of his subjects, and that any limitation on royal authority would constitute blasphemy against divine will. Daily life during the Oprichnina period acquired a surreal quality as ordinary Russians learned to navigate the competing jurisdictions and conflicting loyalties that Ivan's system had created. A merchant traveling from Novgorod to Moscow might find himself subject to Zemshina law in one village and Oprichnina regulations in the next, never knowing which set of officials might demand tribute or which accusations might lead to confiscation of goods. Peasant families discovered that their lords' political allegiances could determine whether they faced normal taxation or arbitrary persecution. The economic consequences of Ivan's policies proved catastrophic. The systematic destruction of boyar estates disrupted agricultural production, while the arbitrary confiscations and redistributions of property created uncertainty that paralyzed commercial activity. Foreign observers noted that Moscow's markets, once bustling with goods from across Eurasia, had become nearly empty as traders sought safer venues for their activities. The population of central Russia appears to have declined significantly during the 1570s, as families fled to the periphery or simply died from the combined effects of war, famine, and political violence. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of Ivan's reign was the gradual recognition that his revolutionary experiments in governance had failed to achieve their intended purposes. The Oprichnina, designed to strengthen royal authority by destroying aristocratic opposition, actually weakened the state by eliminating experienced administrators and military commanders. The Reign of Terror, intended to ensure loyalty, created such fear that officials became paralyzed by indecision rather than empowered by clear authority. The final years of Ivan's reign witnessed a partial retreat from the most extreme policies of the Oprichnina period. The system was officially abolished in 1572, though its psychological effects continued to influence Russian political culture long after its formal dissolution. The Tsar's growing awareness that his policies had damaged the realm he sought to strengthen led to periods of profound remorse and religious observance, as he retreated to monastic cells for prayer and contemplation. The death of Ivan's eldest son and heir in 1581, whether from illness or from injuries sustained during one of the Tsar's violent rages, remains historically uncertain, destroyed the succession plans that might have provided stability for the realm. The Tsar's remaining sons, Fyodor and Dmitry, were respectively too weak and too young to manage the complex inheritance that Ivan's 47-year reign had created. When Ivan IV died in March 1584, while playing chess in his private chambers, he left behind a legacy that would influence Russian political development for centuries. The institutional innovations of his early reign, the law codes, military reforms, and administrative systematization provided foundations for the modern Russian state. Yet the psychological trauma of the Oprichnina period established patterns of arbitrary rule, political paranoia, and the subordination of law to royal will that would plague Russian governance well into the modern era. The great territorial acquisitions of Ivan's reign, from Kazan to Astrakhan to the first Siberian settlements, had transformed Russia from a regional power into a continental empire. Yet the human cost of these achievements had been enormous, and the political methods employed to secure them had created internal weaknesses that would soon threaten the dynasty's very survival. As news of the Tsar's death spread throughout the realm, from the Arctic settlements of the north to the Cossack camps along the southern frontier, his subjects faced an uncertain future. The heir apparent, Fyodor, possessed neither the intellectual capacity nor the political skills necessary for managing the vast, complex, and traumatized realm that his father had bequeathed to him. The stage was set for the greatest crisis in Russian history, a period when the very survival of the state would hang in the balance. The death of Tsar Fyodor in January 1598 extinguished a flame that had burned for over 7 centuries. As the last ruler of the ancient Rurik dynasty, breathed his final breath in the same Kremlin chambers where his ancestors had transformed a minor principality into a vast empire. With no direct heir to inherit the throne, Russia faced a succession crisis that would test every institution, every loyalty, and every assumption upon which the realm had been built. Picture, if you will, the profound silence that settled over Moscow's Red Square as the great bell of Ivan the Great began its mournful tolling, announcing not merely the death of a ruler, but the end of a dynasty whose legitimacy had been accepted without question since the legendary calling of Rurik in 862. In that silence lay questions that no one was prepared to answer. Who could rightfully claim the throne of the Tsars? What made a ruler legitimate when ancient bloodlines failed? How could a realm held together by personal loyalty to a sacred dynasty survive when that dynasty had vanished into history? The election of Boris Godunov by the Zemsky Sobor. Boris, brother-in-law to the late Tsar and the most capable administrator of the previous reign, possessed every qualification for rulership, except the one that mattered most: he was not a Rurik. His 7-year reign, marked by genuine attempts at reform and modernization, was haunted from its beginning by whispers of illegitimacy that no amount of administrative competence could silence. The Great Famine of 161 to 63, which killed perhaps a third of Russia's population, transformed these whispers into a roar of divine displeasure. Picture peasant families in the forests around Moscow, reduced to eating bark and grass as their stored grain supplies vanished, interpreting their suffering through the lens of medieval religious thought that connected earthly prosperity with heavenly approval. If God had withdrawn his blessing from the land, surely it was because an usurper sat upon the throne that belonged by divine right to the house of Rurik. Into this crisis stepped the first of the false Dmitris, that mysterious figure who claimed to be Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, supposedly murdered on Boris Godunov's orders, but miraculously preserved to reclaim his rightful inheritance. Whether Grishka Otrepiev was a defrocked monk with megalomaniac delusions, or a Polish-backed pretender, matters less than the psychological needs his appearance served. Russia desperately wanted to believe that legitimate authority could be restored, that the ancient bloodline had not truly ended, that divine favor might yet return to the realm. The ease with which this obvious impostor gathered support reveals the depth of Russia's political crisis. Cossack armies rallied to his banner, Polish nobles provided military assistance, and even Orthodox hierarchs blessed his cause, all united by the shared conviction that almost any alternative was preferable to the continuing rule of an illegitimate dynasty. When Moscow's gates opened to admit Dmitry in triumph, the crowds that cheered his entry were celebrating not his personal virtues, but their own desperate hope for political salvation. Yet the brief reign of the first false Dmitry exposed the impossible contradictions inherent in his position. His Polish supporters expected rewards that would subordinate Russian interests to foreign control, while his Russian followers demanded policies that would alienate his international backers. His marriage to Marina Menisek, that ambitious Polish noblewoman whose Catholic faith scandalized Orthodox sensibilities, symbolized the cultural compromises that his political survival required. When the Boyar conspiracy led by Vasily Shwisky finally murdered Dmitry in May 1606, they were eliminating not just an individual ruler, but the last hope for simple solutions to Russia's legitimacy crisis. Prince Vasily Shwisky's elevation to the throne inaugurated the most chaotic period in Russian history, as competing claimants, foreign armies, and popular uprisings transformed the realm into a theatre of continuous warfare. The second false, Dmitry established his headquarters at Tushino, creating a rival government, complete with its own patriarch, its own boyar council, and its own administrative apparatus. For several years, Russia possessed two czars, two capitals, and two completely incompatible visions of legitimate authority. Meanwhile, Swedish armies occupied Novgorod, Polish forces controlled the Kremlin itself, and Cossack bands under Ivan Bolotnikov waged what amounted to social revolution across the southern provinces. Picture the ancient Kremlin, that symbol of Russian power and Orthodox faith, occupied by Catholic Polish soldiers who celebrated Mass in the same cathedrals where Russian czars had been crowned for centuries. The violation seemed to confirm the worst fears of those who saw the time of troubles as divine punishment for national sins. Yet from this apparent catastrophe emerged the spiritual and cultural resources that would ultimately save Russian civilization from complete dissolution. The Trinity Monastery, that great spiritual center founded by Saint Sergius of Radonej, became a focal point for national resistance under the leadership of Archimandrite Dionysius. The monastery's successful defense against Polish siege in 1608-1609 provided a powerful symbol of Russian resilience, proving that Orthodox faith and national identity remained stronger than foreign military superiority. The popular uprising that eventually expelled the Polish occupiers began not with aristocratic leadership, but with the spontaneous patriotism of ordinary citizens. Kuzma Minin, a butcher from Nizhny Novgorod, used his own resources and moral authority to organize a national militia, while Prince Dmitry Pozharsky provided the military leadership necessary to transform popular enthusiasm into effective resistance. Their march on Moscow in 1612 represented something unprecedented in Russian history: successful political action organized from below rather than imposed from above. The liberation of the Kremlin in October 1612 marked not just military victory, but spiritual renewal, as Orthodox priests purified the desecrated cathedrals with holy water and incense, while crowds of believers wept with relief and gratitude. Yet the most difficult task remained, selecting a new Tsar who could unite the exhausted realm and restore the legitimate authority that 7 years of chaos had destroyed. The Zemsky Sobor that convened in 1613 represented the most democratic moment in Russian history before the 20th century, as representatives from across the social spectrum gathered to debate the future of their civilization. The election of 16-year-old Michael Romanov reflected not enthusiasm for his personal qualities. He was young, inexperienced, and had played no significant role in the national liberation, but rather the desperate need for a candidate who could be acceptable to all factions while owing obligations to none. The Romanov candidacy possessed the crucial advantage of combining noble ancestry with popular support, orthodox legitimacy with political neutrality. Michael's great-aunt had been Ivan the Terrible's first wife, providing a tenuous connection to the sacred Rurik bloodline, while his father's imprisonment by the Poles had established the family's patriotic credentials. Most importantly, the Romanovs had remained above the factional struggles that had discredited other noble houses during the time of troubles. The coronation of Michael Romanov in July 1630 marked the beginning of recovery from the greatest crisis in Russian history. Yet the new Tsar inherited a realm devastated by years of warfare, foreign occupation, and internal strife. Entire regions had been depopulated, cities lay in ruins, and the administrative apparatus that had taken centuries to construct had been shattered by the repeated changes of government. The early Romanov restoration succeeded not through dramatic innovations, but through patient reconstruction of traditional institutions and relationships. The new dynasty carefully cultivated the Orthodox Church, whose support had proved crucial during the national resistance, while systematically rebuilding the service nobility whose loyalty provided the foundation for centralized authority. The peasantry, exhausted by years of warfare and social upheaval, accepted the restoration of serfdom as the price of peace and stability. Perhaps most remarkably, the time of troubles had actually strengthened Russian national consciousness by testing it under extreme pressure. The experience of foreign occupation had clarified the essential elements of Russian identity: Orthodox faith, autocratic government, and cultural independence, while demonstrating that these values commanded sufficient popular support to survive even dynastic extinction. The Romanov restoration thus represented not just political recovery, but cultural affirmation. As the new dynasty gradually extended its authority across the recovering realm, from the Arctic settlements of the north to the Cossack territories of the south, it carried with it lessons learned during the darkest period in Russian history. The survival of Russian civilization during the time of troubles had required the active participation of all social classes, from boyar conspirators to peasant partisans, creating precedents for popular involvement in national affairs that would influence Russian political development for centuries. Yet the restoration also reinforced the traditional association between effective government and autocratic authority, as the chaos of the interregnum seemed to demonstrate the dangers of political experimentation. The new Romanov dynasty would rule with the confidence that comes from having been chosen by national consensus, yet it would exercise that authority within institutional frameworks that had been tested by crisis and found adequate for Russian conditions. In the pre-dawn darkness of an August morning in 1689, as mist rose from the ponds surrounding the Trinity Monastery outside Moscow, a 17-year-old Tsar crept through the monastery gates wearing only his nightshirt. his heart pounding with the terror of imminent assassination. Peter Alexievich had fled the Kremlin in panic upon learning that his half-sister Sophia's supporters might be planning his murder, seeking sanctuary in the ancient walls where his ancestors had found refuge during the time of troubles. Yet this moment of apparent weakness marked the beginning of the most revolutionary reign in Russian history, as the frightened youth would transform himself into the autocrat who would drag his empire, willingly or not, into the modern European world. The young Peter, who emerged from this crisis, possessed a mind unlike any previous Russian ruler, restlessly curious, mechanically gifted, and fundamentally convinced that Russia's survival depended upon mastering the technical knowledge that had made Western Europe the dominant force in global affairs. Picture him in the foreign quarter of Moscow, that remarkable enclave where Dutch merchants, German craftsmen, and Scottish soldiers maintained their own customs and practices within the heart of Orthodox Russia. Here, among the workshops and warehouses of these European expatriates, Peter discovered a world of possibilities that traditional Muscovite culture had never imagined. The sight of Dutch shipwrights constructing vessels using mathematical principles and precise measurements fascinated the young Tsar, whose previous education had focused on Orthodox theology and ceremonial protocol. When Franz Timmerman, a Dutch mathematician, introduced him to geometry and navigation, Peter experienced the intellectual excitement of discovering that the physical world operated according to comprehensible laws rather than divine mystery. The small boat that he learned to sail on a pond near Moscow, later venerated as the grandfather of the Russian fleet, represented more than recreational activity. It symbolized a new relationship between Russian authority and European knowledge. The decision to undertake the Great Embassy to Western Europe in 1697 reflected Peter's revolutionary conviction that a Russian Tsar could learn from foreign masters without compromising his authority or his realm's independence. Picture the unprecedented spectacle of the Tsar of all Russias, working as an ordinary carpenter in the shipyards of Amsterdam, his hands blistered from handling unfamiliar tools, his notebooks filled with technical drawings and mechanical specifications. European observers marveled at this giant of a man. Peter stood nearly 7 feet tall, who possessed the physical strength to wield an axe with deadly efficiency, yet displayed the intellectual humility to apprentice himself to Dutch master craftsmen. Yet the Great Embassy revealed more than Peter's personal fascination with European technology. It exposed the enormous gap between Russian capabilities and European standards that threatened his empire's very survival. The ships that he examined in English dockyards could carry more cannon than entire Russian armies possessed, while the precision manufacturing he observed in German workshops produced goods of a quality that Russian artisans could barely comprehend. The mathematical education that European officers took for granted remained unknown to Russian nobles, whose military training consisted primarily of learning ceremonial precedents and traditional tactics that had become obsolete generations earlier. The abrupt termination of the embassy due to news of the Streltsy revolt provided Peter with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his transformed vision of royal authority. The systematic execution of over 1,000 rebels, many of them tortured and killed by Peter's own hand, sent an unmistakable message that the young Tsar who returned from Europe was fundamentally different from the uncertain youth who had departed. Yet the violence served a purpose beyond mere revenge. It eliminated the old guard that might have resisted the revolutionary changes that Peter was preparing to impose. The founding of St. Petersburg in 1703 represented the most audacious act of will in Russian history, as Peter literally created a new capital from the Finnish marshlands that his armies had recently conquered from Sweden. Picture the thousands of conscript laborers who died building this window to Europe, their bones forming the foundations of a city designed to embody Peter's vision of a westernized Russia. The geometric regularity of the planned streets, so different from the organic growth of ancient Moscow, reflected European urban planning principles, while the Baroque architecture of the new palaces and government buildings announced Russia's determination to compete with European courts on their own aesthetic terms. Yet the human cost of Peter's modernization program was staggering. The construction of St. Cyril, Petersburg alone, consumed an estimated 100,000 lives, while the continuous warfare required to secure Russia's new European status decimated the population of entire regions. The poll tax introduced to fund these ambitious projects fell most heavily on the peasantry, whose burdens increased dramatically even as their legal status declined toward outright slavery. The service obligations imposed on the nobility, requiring lifelong military or civilian service to the state, transformed the traditional relationship between Tsar and aristocracy into something resembling a vast military organization. Daily life throughout Russian society felt the pressure of Peter's revolutionary agenda. Noble families found their sons conscripted for decades of service in European-style armies, while their daughters were expected to abandon the seclusion of the harem for the public sociability of European court culture. The traditional beards that had marked Orthodox masculinity for centuries fell to Peter's scissors, while European dress codes replaced the ancient kaftans and fur hats that had distinguished Russian nobles from their foreign contemporaries. The Orthodox Church, that ancient pillar of Russian civilization, experienced perhaps the most radical transformation of any institution during Peter's reign. The abolition of the Patriarchate and its replacement with the Holy Synod, a government department staffed by appointed officials, effectively transformed the Church from an independent spiritual authority into an arm of state administration. Monasteries found their lands confiscated and their functions redirected toward education and social services, while parish priests were required to report confession secrets that might threaten state security. The Battle of Poltava in 79 marked the moment when Peter's revolutionary reforms proved their worth in the most demanding test possible. Picture that July morning when Charles XIII of Sweden, perhaps the greatest military genius of his generation, discovered that his seasoned veterans could no longer overwhelm Russian forces through superior training and leadership. Peter's systematically reformed army, equipped with modern weapons and trained in contemporary tactics, not only held its ground, but achieved decisive victory against Europe's most formidable military power. Yet the significance of Poltava extended far beyond military achievement. The victory announced Russia's emergence as a European great power, capable of competing successfully with the most advanced Western states. The captured Swedish standards that Peter displayed in Moscow demonstrated to his subjects that their sacrifices had purchased genuine security and international recognition. Foreign diplomats who had previously treated Russia as a semi-barbarous periphery now sought alliance with the northern giant whose armies could march from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The cultural transformation of Peter's reign created tensions that would influence Russian consciousness for centuries. The noble elite, educated in European languages and customs, gradually became alienated from the peasant masses who remained rooted in traditional Orthodox culture. This division between a westernized upper class and a traditional popular culture would generate the literary and intellectual movements that gave 19th century Russia its distinctive voice in world culture. The administrative innovations of Peter's reign established patterns that would define Russian governance well into the modern era, the table of ranks, which made advancement dependent on merit rather than birth, created opportunities for social mobility unknown in traditional Muscovite society. Yet it also strengthened the association between social status and state service, making the autocracy the sole source of legitimate advancement, while weakening the independent institutions that might have limited royal authority. The industrial development that Peter promoted, from the iron foundries of the Urals to the textile manufactories of Moscow, began the process of economic modernization that would eventually transform Russia from an agricultural society into an industrial power. Yet these early enterprises depended heavily on serf labor and state subsidy, creating patterns of economic dependence that would influence Russian development for generations. Perhaps most significantly, Peter's reign established the principle that Russia could selectively adopt Western techniques while maintaining its essential cultural identity. The synthetic civilization that emerged from his reforms combined European administrative methods with orthodox spiritual traditions, Western military technology with Russian territorial ambitions, Enlightenment rationalism with autocratic political structures. As Peter died in 1725, tortured by the kidney ailment that had plagued his final years, he left behind a realm that had been fundamentally transformed, yet remained recognizably Russian. The empire that his successors inherited was simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable than the Muscovite state he had revolutionized, more sophisticated yet more dependent on continued contact with European civilization, more capable of great achievements, yet more susceptible to the internal contradictions that rapid modernization had created. The great question that Peter's legacy posed for his successors was whether the revolutionary energy that had created modern Russia could be sustained by rulers who lacked his extraordinary combination of physical courage, intellectual curiosity, and ruthless determination to subordinate all competing interests to the demands of state power. In the hushed elegance of the Winter Palace Library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes of Voltaire and Diderot that had arrived with the latest diplomatic pouch from Paris, a German princess who had transformed herself into Catherine II of Russia sat composing her instructions for legal reform. The year was 1767, and this remarkable woman who had seized the Russian throne 5 years earlier through a palace coup that eliminated her husband Peter III was attempting something unprecedented: the creation of a legal code based on Enlightenment principles for the largest and most diverse empire in the world. Picture Catherine in those early morning hours when the palace lay silent, except for the scratch of her pen across parchment, as she wrestled with the fundamental contradiction that would define her reign. How could the rational humanism of European philosophy be reconciled with the practical requirements of governing a realm that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups and millions of serfs whose labor sustained the entire social order? The Empress, who corresponded familiarly with the greatest minds of the French Enlightenment, was also the autocrat who would extend serfdom more completely than any previous ruler. The nakaz that emerged from Catherine's philosophical labors represented both the heights of Enlightenment optimism and the limitations imposed by Russian realities, drawing heavily on Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws and Beccaria's treatise on criminal justice. Catherine's instructions proclaimed that Russia is a European state whose laws should reflect the rational principles that progressive thinkers considered universal. Yet when the Legislative Commission convened in 1767 to discuss these reforms, the delegates' representatives from across the empire's social spectrum quickly demonstrated that Enlightenment abstractions meant very different things to different constituencies. The debates that echoed through the Commission's sessions revealed the complexities of Catherine's empire in ways that no amount of philosophical reading could have prepared her to understand. Picture delegates from the Cossack territories arguing for the preservation of their ancient freedoms, while representatives of the service nobility insisted on the maintenance of serf labor that made their military obligations possible. Merchants from St. Petersburg requested commercial privileges that would disadvantage their competitors from Moscow, while Old Believers petitioned for religious toleration that Orthodox hierarchs considered heretical. Yet Catherine's genius lay not in resolving these contradictions, but in transcending them through the sheer force of her imperial vision. The Hermitage collection that she assembled during her reign, beginning with the acquisition of entire private galleries from financially pressed European aristocrats, symbolized her determination to make St. Petersburg during her reign, Petersburg, a cultural capital that could rival Paris or Vienna. Picture the Empress walking through galleries filled with Rembrandts and Rubens, Watteaus and Fragonards, creating through artistic patronage a visual argument for Russia's membership in European civilization. The territorial expansion that marked Catherine's reign represented the systematic completion of projects that had been developing for centuries. The conquest of Crimea in 1783 finally eliminated the last remnant of the Golden Horde, while the destruction of the Ottoman fortress of Ochakov opened the entire Black Sea to Russian navigation and commerce. Picture Grigory Potemkin, Catherine's most capable general and perhaps her greatest love, orchestrating the colonization of the southern steppes with the same attention to detail that he devoted to the theatrical spectacles that impressed foreign visitors. The famous Potemkin villages, whether they actually existed as completely fabricated settlements or merely represented the normal tendency to display imperial achievements in their most favorable light, symbolized the complex relationship between reality and representation that characterized Catherine's reign. The Empress, who proclaimed her devotion to Enlightenment principles, also understood that political power depended partly on the ability to create compelling narratives about imperial achievements. The integration of the newly conquered territories revealed Catherine's remarkable capacity for administrative innovation. Rather than simply imposing Russian institutions on diverse populations, she developed flexible systems of governance that preserved local customs while ensuring imperial control. The Greek merchants who had served Ottoman masters found themselves welcomed as Russian subjects, while Tatar nobles who submitted to imperial authority retained their estates and social positions. The German colonists invited to settle the Volga region brought agricultural techniques and craft skills that enriched the entire imperial economy. Yet beneath the cultural brilliance and territorial expansion of Catherine's reign lay the fundamental contradiction that would ultimately undermine the entire imperial system. The Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775 exposed the rage that simmered beneath the surface of rural Russia, as Emelian Pugachev's Cossack followers and peasant allies waged what amounted to social revolution across vast territories of the Urals and Volga regions. Picture the Empress in her St. Petersburg palace, surrounded by the latest philosophical treatises from Paris, reading reports of atrocities committed in her name and against her authority with equal horror. Pugachev's proclamation promising the elimination of serfdom and the execution of noble landowners revealed the alternative vision of Russian development that existed alongside Catherine's enlightened absolutism. The systematic brutality with which the rebellion was eventually suppressed. Pugachev himself was executed in Moscow's Red Square, demonstrated the violence upon which the entire imperial system ultimately rested. The charter to the nobility issued in 1785 represented Catherine's attempt to resolve the contradictions of her reign by creating a stable social hierarchy based on explicit privileges and obligations. Noble status became hereditary and legally protected, while serf ownership was confirmed as an inviolable property right. The empress, who had corresponded with Voltaire about the evils of slavery, was simultaneously creating the most comprehensive legal framework for human bondage in European history. Yet the cultural achievements of Catherine's reign transcended these political contradictions through their sheer magnificence. The Academy of Arts that she founded produced painters and sculptors whose works rivaled the best European productions, while the educational institutions that she established created the first generation of genuinely literate Russians outside the nobility and clergy. The plays of Denis von Vezin satirized the pretensions and ignorance of provincial nobles with a wit that anticipated the great tradition of Russian literature, while the poetry of Gavrila Dershavin celebrated imperial achievements in verses that combined classical restraint with distinctly Russian emotional intensity. The architecture of Catherine's reign created the visual framework within which imperial Russia would present itself to the world for generations. Picture the Winter Palace as Bartolomeo Rastrelli expanded it, with its Baroque facades stretching along the Neva River like a continuous argument for the sophistication of Russian taste. The palace at Tsarskoye Selo, with its famous amber room and Chinese-inspired pavilions, demonstrated the empire's ability to synthesize influences from across the known world into coherently Russian artistic statements. The diplomatic achievements of Catherine's reign established Russia as a permanent member of the European balance of power, whose friendship or enmity could determine the outcome of continental conflicts. The League of Armed Neutrality during the American Revolution demonstrated Russia's ability to challenge British maritime supremacy, while Catherine's intervention in the affairs of Poland showed that Russian influence now extended deep into Central Europe. Yet, perhaps the most significant achievement of Catherine's reign was the creation of a distinctly Russian version of Enlightenment culture that would influence intellectual development for generations. The Empress, who had arrived as a minor German princess speaking no Russian, became the patron of a cultural renaissance that produced some of the greatest achievements in Russian history. The University of Moscow that she supported, the medical schools that she founded, the legal reforms that she sponsored, all contributed to the emergence of an educated Russian society, capable of engaging with European intellectual developments on equal terms. The contradiction between Enlightenment ideals and autocratic practice that defined Catherine's reign would become the central theme of 19th century Russian intellectual life. The generation of nobles educated in Catherine's schools would produce the Decembrists who challenged autocratic authority in 1825, while the literary culture that flourished under her patronage would eventually generate the great novels that made Russian literature a global force. As Catherine died in 1796, struck down by a stroke while working in her private study, she left behind an empire that had achieved everything she had dreamed of and revealed every contradiction she had hoped to resolve. The Russia that her son Paul inherited was simultaneously the most cultured and the most repressive state in Europe, the most powerful and the most vulnerable to internal revolution, the most successful example of enlightened absolutism, and the most complete demonstration of its ultimate impossibility. The great palaces that Catherine had built, filled with artistic treasures gathered from across Europe, would shelter her successors as they struggled with the legacy of her achievements. The legal codes that she had promulgated the administrative systems that she had created, the cultural institutions that she had founded, all would continue to function long after the philosophical optimism that had inspired them had given way to the darker realities of 19th century politics. Yet the golden age that Catherine had created, through the force of her extraordinary personality and imperial vision, had established standards of cultural achievement and political sophistication that would influence Russian development for centuries. The synthesis of European learning with Russian traditions, of Enlightenment rationalism with orthodox spirituality, of cosmopolitan sophistication with patriotic commitment, all would become permanent features of Russian civilization, though the tensions between them would continue to generate both creative energy and political instability in the amber twilight of European diplomacy, where chancelleries hummed with the intricate machinery of continental balance. Russia found itself inexorably drawn into a confrontation that would define not merely territorial boundaries, but the very essence of imperial identity. The War of 1812 emerged not as a sudden rupture, but as the inevitable collision between two incompatible visions of European civilization: Napoleon's rational, centralized imperium and Russia's organic, orthodox autocracy. Alexander I, that most enigmatic of Romanov sovereigns, embodied the philosophical tensions of his age. Educated in Enlightenment principles, yet heir to Byzantine traditions, he navigated the treacherous currents of European diplomacy with a sensitivity that bordered on neurosis. His correspondence with Napoleon reveals a mind simultaneously attracted to and repelled by the revolutionary emperor's vision of rational reorganization. When diplomatic solutions finally dissolved in the acid of irreconcilable ambitions, both rulers understood they were gambling not merely with armies, but with the fundamental principles upon which their respective civilizations rested. The Grande Armée's invasion in June 1812 unfolded like a geological catastrophe across the Russian landscape. 600,000 men, representing every corner of Napoleon's European empire, moved eastward with the mechanical precision that had conquered Austria and Prussia. Yet the vastness of Russian territory immediately began working its subtle alchemy upon this magnificent military instrument. Where European campaigns had been decided by single battles and swift capitulations, Russia offered only endless horizons punctuated by abandoned villages and retreating armies. The Russian strategy of strategic withdrawal represented a profound departure from conventional European military wisdom. Prince Barclay de Tolly, that methodical Scottish-descended general, understood intuitively what his critics could not grasp: that Russia's greatest weapon was Russia itself. The decision to trade space for time reflected not cowardice, but a sophisticated understanding of national resources. Every verst surrendered drew Napoleon's supply lines thinner. Every day of delay brought the Russian winter closer. Every abandoned settlement demonstrated that this was not a war between armies, but between incompatible ways of life. Moscow's burning in September 1812 crystallized the existential nature of this struggle. When Governor Rostopchin ordered the evacuation and systematic destruction of the ancient capital, he was orchestrating perhaps the most dramatic act of national self-sacrifice in European history. The flames that consumed the Kremlin's surrounding city represented more than military strategy. Napoleon, accustomed to capturing capitals as political trophies, found himself master of a magnificent ruin in a depopulated wasteland. The French emperor's sojourn in Moscow revealed the psychological dimensions of imperial overextension. Surrounded by the charred remnants of Russian civilization, he waited for surrender negotiations that would never come. Alexander's silence spoke volumes about the nature of Russian resistance. This was not a rational calculation of territorial losses and strategic advantages, but an organic rejection of foreign domination that transcended political pragmatism. The retreat from Moscow transformed military campaign into human tragedy on an unprecedented scale. The Grande Armée, that marvel of Napoleonic organization, disintegrated not through dramatic battles, but through the relentless attrition of climate, distance, and popular resistance. Partisan bands, emerging spontaneously from the Russian countryside, harassed the retreating columns with a ferocity that shocked European observers accustomed to conventional warfare between professional armies. Kutuzov, the one-eyed field marshal whose strategic patience had preserved Russian forces through the campaign's opening phases, emerged as the embodiment of indigenous wisdom triumphing over foreign sophistication. His careful pursuit of Napoleon's retreat, close enough to maintain pressure, distant enough to avoid unnecessary casualties, demonstrated a profound understanding of how time and space could be weaponized more effectively than artillery and cavalry. The old general's peasant cunning, so different from the mathematical precision of Napoleonic warfare, revealed alternative forms of military genius rooted in cultural authenticity rather than systematic innovation. The crossing of the Berezina in November 1812 became the symbolic moment when Napoleon's retreat transformed into comprehensive disaster. The river, swollen with early winter floods, created a natural bottleneck where military engineering confronted elemental forces. The bridge construction, under impossible conditions, represented both the residual effectiveness of French organization and its ultimate futility against the combined pressures of climate, terrain, and popular resistance. Russian victory over Napoleon resonated far beyond military achievement. It represented the triumph of organic society over rational reconstruction, traditional authority over revolutionary innovation, spiritual endurance over material calculation. The war demonstrated that Russia possessed resources unavailable to more advanced European societies: the capacity for collective sacrifice, the patience for extended struggle, the willingness to endure temporary defeat for ultimate vindication. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 found Russia emerged as Europe's dominant power, yet this triumph contained dangerous precedents for future imperial development. Alexander's role in Napoleon's final defeat established Russia as the guarantor of European stability, creating expectations for future intervention that would eventually prove unsustainable. The mystical religiosity that increasingly characterized the Tsar's later years reflected both genuine spiritual conviction and psychological response to the burdens of continental leadership. The Napoleonic challenge revealed Russia's capacity for remarkable resilience while exposing the costs of imperial greatness. Victory preserved Russian independence and enhanced international prestige, but the war's aftermath demonstrated how external triumph could intensify internal contradictions. The officers who had pursued Napoleon to Paris returned with dangerous ideas about constitutional government and social reform that would ferment into the Decembrist movement. The peasants who had demonstrated such remarkable patriotism remained bound in serfdom, creating moral contradictions that thoughtful observers could not ignore. The century stretching from Napoleon's defeat to Nicholas II's coronation unfolded as an extended meditation on the fundamental incompatibilities between autocratic tradition and modernizing necessity. Russia emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as Europe's most powerful state, yet this external triumph masked internal contradictions that would ultimately prove more dangerous than foreign invasion. The dilemma was profound. How could an empire maintain the traditional sources of its strength while adapting to the technological and social innovations that defined modernity? The Decembrist uprising of 1825 announced themes that would haunt Russian consciousness throughout the century. Those young officers who gathered in Senate Square represented more than political conspiracy. They embodied the tragic tension between European ideas and Russian realities. Educated in Enlightenment principles through their military service abroad, exposed to constitutional government during the occupation of Paris, they returned to an empire where such concepts remained not merely foreign but potentially treasonous. Their revolt, pathetically inadequate as military action, succeeded brilliantly as cultural symbol, establishing the archetype of the educated noble sacrificing personal comfort for abstract principles of justice and social progress. Nicholas I's response to the Decembrist challenge revealed the conservative synthesis that would define imperial policy for decades. His doctrine of official nationality, orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality, represented a sophisticated attempt to create indigenous alternatives to European liberalism. Rather than simply rejecting Western innovations, Nicholas sought to demonstrate that Russia possessed superior organizing principles rooted in spiritual authenticity rather than rational calculation. The third section, his secret police organization, became the instrument through which this conservative ideology was enforced, creating a surveillance apparatus that monitored not merely revolutionary activity, but the circulation of dangerous ideas themselves. Yet even this most reactionary of emperors could not entirely resist modernizing pressures. The construction of the St. Petersburg-Moscow Railway in the 1840s symbolized the contradictions inherent in conservative modernization. While the regime celebrated this technological achievement as evidence of Russian progress, critics observed that railroads, like ideas, possessed their own logic that ultimately proved incompatible with traditional social organization. The mobility that enhanced state power also facilitated the circulation of revolutionary concepts. The commercial development that strengthened imperial finances also created new social classes with their own political interests. The Crimean War of 1854-1856 administered a devastating shock to Russian self-confidence, revealing the inadequacy of traditional methods in the face of industrialized warfare. The siege of Sevastopol became a prolonged demonstration of technological backwardness disguised as heroic resistance. While Russian soldiers displayed their characteristic courage and endurance, they lacked the rifles, railways, and medical facilities that their European opponents took for granted. The war's outcome, defeat by Britain and France on Russian territory, forced even the most conservative elements to acknowledge that military effectiveness now depended upon industrial capacity and administrative efficiency rather than merely numerical superiority and patriotic enthusiasm. Alexander II's accession in 1855 initiated the most comprehensive reform program in Russian history. Yet even these dramatic changes revealed the persistence of traditional patterns beneath surface innovation. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861, that most fundamental of social transformations, demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of autocratic reform. The abolition of bondage represented a moral triumph that eliminated the most glaring contradiction between Russian practice and European standards. Yet the complex arrangements for peasant land redemption created new forms of rural control that preserved many aspects of the traditional social hierarchy. The liberation process itself revealed the intricate negotiations required to transform a servile society into something approaching free labor organization. Peasant families, suddenly confronted with legal freedom after centuries of bondage, found themselves enmeshed in financial obligations and administrative procedures that often proved more onerous than the traditional obligations they replaced. The mir, or peasant commune, became the institution through which individual liberation was channeled into collective responsibility, creating hybrid arrangements that satisfied neither traditional nor modern organizational principles. Judicial reform in 1864 introduced Western legal procedures into Russian society, with consequences that extended far beyond courtroom practice. The establishment of independent judges, public trials, and jury systems created spaces for civil society that had not previously existed under autocratic rule. Lawyers emerged as a new professional class, with interests distinct from both bureaucratic service and landed property, while public trials became theatres where social criticism could be expressed under the protection of legal procedure. The regime's attempt to modernize judicial administration inadvertently created institutional foundations for political opposition. The Zemstvo system, introduced in 1864 as a concession to demands for local self-government, exemplified the contradictions inherent in autocratic liberalization. These elected assemblies were granted authority over local education, healthcare, and economic development, yet their jurisdiction was carefully circumscribed to prevent political challenges to central authority. The Zemstvo activists who emerged from this system, progressive landowners, professional men, reform-minded bureaucrats, gradually developed a political consciousness that transcended local issues to encompass national questions of constitutional government and civil rights. Educational expansion under Alexander II created perhaps the most dangerous challenge to traditional authority. The relaxation of university restrictions, the expansion of secondary schooling, and the emergence of women's educational opportunities produced a generation of Russians exposed to European political and social theories without corresponding opportunities for legitimate political participation. Student movements of the 1860s and 1870s represented more than youthful rebellion. They embodied the systematic frustration of educated intelligence by institutional backwardness. The revolutionary populist movement that emerged in the 1870s demonstrated how European socialist theories could be adapted to Russian conditions with explosive results. Young intellectuals like Nikolai Chernyshevsky and Sergei Nekhaev transformed abstract theories of social transformation into practical programs of revolutionary action, creating the ideological framework that would ultimately destroy the imperial system. Their "Going to the People" campaigns revealed both the sincerity of their social concern and the profound cultural gap separating educated society from peasant reality. The assassination of Alexander II in 1881 marked the decisive moment when reform hopes died with the reformer. The bomb that killed the Tsar Liberator on a St. Cyr's, Petersburg Street symbolized the tragic irony of Russian political development. The most liberal emperor in Russian history destroyed by the very forces his liberalization had unleashed. Alexander III's accession brought systematic reaction designed to reverse the reform process. Yet, the social and economic changes of the previous decades had acquired their own momentum that proved impossible to contain through administrative measures alone. The industrial development that accelerated under Alexander III created new social realities that traditional autocracy could neither comprehend nor control. Factory workers in St. Paul Petersburg and Moscow represented a social phenomenon unknown to previous Russian experience, a proletariat with neither traditional peasant ties nor gentry obligations, responsive to neither orthodox preaching nor patriarchal authority. The strikes and labor unrest that began in the 1880s announced the emergence of class consciousness that would prove incompatible with autocratic paternalism. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, symbolized both the achievements and limitations of conservative modernization. This magnificent engineering project, stretching across 11 time zones to connect European Russia with the Pacific Ocean, represented state capacity on an unprecedented scale. Yet the railway also facilitated the very social mobility and economic development that made traditional political control increasingly difficult to maintain. Siberian development brought Russian settlers into contact with Asian populations, creating new administrative challenges that required innovative solutions incompatible with established bureaucratic procedures. By century's end, Russia faced the paradox that would define its final imperial decades. Economic and social development had proceeded far enough to make traditional autocracy anachronistic, yet not far enough to provide stable foundations for constitutional government. The educated classes had acquired European political consciousness without corresponding institutional frameworks, while the masses remained largely excluded from both traditional and modern forms of political participation. This unstable equilibrium could be maintained only through increasingly sophisticated forms of repression that ultimately proved incompatible with the economic development they were designed to protect. The final decades of Romanov rule unfolded as a Greek tragedy where protagonists, despite occasional moments of insight and nobility, found themselves trapped by historical forces beyond their capacity to control or comprehend. Nicholas II, ascending the throne in 1894, embodied the personal virtues and systemic limitations that would define the empire's terminal crisis. Devoted to family, sincere in religious conviction, genuinely concerned for his subjects' welfare, he nevertheless lacked the intellectual flexibility and political imagination required to navigate the revolutionary currents that industrialization had unleashed across Russian society. The 1905 revolution emerged not as sudden explosion, but as the inevitable culmination of contradictions that had been accumulating since the Great Reforms. The Russo-Japanese War, that humiliating defeat by an Asian power previously dismissed as militarily insignificant, administered the shock that exposed the hollowness of imperial pretensions. Russian battleships sunk in Port Arthur Harbor symbolized more than naval incompetence. Bloody Sunday, January 9, 1905, transformed the relationship between Tsar and people in ways that proved irreversible. Father Gapon's procession to the Winter Palace, carrying icons and portraits of Nicholas II while petitioning for elementary justice, represented the last moment when traditional forms of monarchical legitimacy might have been preserved through genuine reform. The decision to fire upon peaceful petitioners destroyed centuries of patriarchal mythology in a single afternoon, replacing reverence with revolutionary consciousness among masses previously immune to radical propaganda. The October Manifesto, promising constitutional government and civil liberties, represented Nicholas II's most statesmanlike moment, yet even this apparent capitulation revealed the fundamental incompatibility between autocratic tradition and constitutional practice. The emperor's evident reluctance to honor his promises, the court's systematic undermining of parliamentary authority, and the regime's manipulation of electoral procedures demonstrated that Russia's rulers had learned nothing from the revolutionary crisis beyond the tactical necessity of temporary concessions. Peter Stolypin emerged as the most talented statesman of the late imperial period. Yet his career illustrated the impossibility of reforming autocracy from within. His agricultural reforms, designed to create a class of independent peasant proprietors loyal to the existing order, represented sophisticated understanding of how social transformation might be channeled in conservative directions. Yet Stolypin's assassination in 1911, significantly in the Tsar's presence at a Kiev theatre, symbolized the violent polarization that made moderate reform increasingly impossible. The Rasputin affair revealed the moral bankruptcy that had infected the imperial family itself. Gregory Rasputin, that dissolute Siberian peasant whose influence over Alexandra Fyodorovna scandalized educated society, became the perfect symbol of autocratic decay. His ability to alleviate the hemophilic attacks suffered by Tsarevich Alexei created a private dependency that had devastating public consequences. The Empress's protection of this disreputable figure, motivated by maternal desperation, provided revolutionary propaganda with more damaging material than decades of underground agitation could have produced. World War I administered the final shock to a political system already strained beyond its capacity to function effectively. The decision for mobilization in August 1914, greeted with patriotic enthusiasm that temporarily united society behind the throne, soon revealed the devastating inadequacy of Russian military and industrial organization. The human cost, millions of casualties, economic collapse, administrative chaos, exceeded the empire's capacity to sustain while maintaining domestic stability. The February Revolution of 1917 unfolded not as dramatic overthrow, but as comprehensive institutional collapse. Nicholas II's abdication, announced in a brief telegram from his railway carriage, marked the end of 3 centuries of Romanov rule with anticlimactic simplicity. The provisional government that emerged from this political vacuum faced the impossible task of maintaining imperial commitments while satisfying revolutionary expectations, conducting foreign war while implementing domestic transformation. Alexander Kerensky, that eloquent lawyer who became the revolution's most visible leader, embodied both the possibilities and limitations of liberal democracy in Russian conditions. His passionate oratory and genuine commitment to constitutional government won admiration from educated society, yet his inability to address fundamental questions, land redistribution, war continuation, economic collapse, left him politically isolated as crises deepened. The gap between liberal ideals and revolutionary realities proved unbridgeable through parliamentary procedures alone. Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 transformed the revolutionary dynamic through the introduction of systematic radical theory into chaotic political practice. His April theses, demanding immediate peace, land redistribution, and worker control, addressed popular grievances that moderate politicians had been unable or unwilling to tackle. The Bolshevik program's apparent simplicity disguised sophisticated understanding of how revolutionary situations developed their own momentum beyond rational political calculation. The October Revolution succeeded not through popular uprising, but through disciplined organization exploiting governmental paralysis. The Bolshevik seizure of strategic points in Petrograd met minimal resistance because the provisional government had lost effective authority months earlier. The storming of the Winter Palace, mythologized in Soviet historiography as epic popular struggle, actually involved fewer casualties than typical industrial accidents, revealing how completely imperial authority had dissolved. The Russian Civil War that followed represented the inevitable consequence of revolutionary transformation in a multinational empire with poorly developed civil society. White armies, representing various combinations of monarchist restoration, liberal democracy, and military dictatorship, fought red forces committed to socialist reconstruction across territories spanning 11 time zones. Foreign intervention by Britain, France, Japan, and the United States added international dimensions to domestic conflicts, creating complexities that no single political movement could successfully navigate. The human cost of imperial collapse, revolution, civil war, famine, epidemic disease exceeded the casualties of World War I itself. Millions died, not through dramatic battles, but through the systemic breakdown of transportation, food distribution, medical care, and basic administration that accompanies comprehensive political collapse. The emigration of educated elites, the destruction of cultural institutions, the dissolution of legal frameworks created social devastation that extended far beyond immediate political consequences. Regional separatism during the revolutionary period revealed how artificially imperial unity had been maintained through bureaucratic centralization rather than organic social integration. Finland, Poland, the Baltic provinces, Ukraine, Georgia, and other non-Russian territories declared independence as soon as central authority weakened, demonstrating that centuries of administrative integration had not created genuine imperial patriotism among minority populations. The execution of Nicholas II and his family in July 1918 provided a symbolic conclusion to imperial history while raising disturbing questions about revolutionary morality. The decision to murder not merely the former emperor, but his wife and children reflected Bolshevik understanding that monarchical restoration remained possible as long as Romanov heirs survived. Yet this practical calculation required moral compromises that undermined revolutionary idealism, establishing precedents for systematic violence that would characterize Soviet rule. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, concluding Russia's participation in World War I through humiliating territorial concessions to Germany, marked the definitive end of imperial foreign policy. Lenin's willingness to sacrifice Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic provinces, and other territories to secure Bolshevik survival represented a fundamental departure from traditional Russian strategic thinking, prioritizing ideological revolution over territorial integrity. By 1921, when the Civil War finally concluded with Bolshevik victory, the Russian Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity, yet its territorial boundaries, administrative structures, and cultural patterns provided the foundation upon which the Soviet Union would be constructed. The revolution had destroyed autocratic institutions while preserving imperial geography, creating new forms of centralized authority that would prove remarkably similar to their Tsarist predecessors in many fundamental respects. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 marked not an ending, but a transformation, as the institutional patterns, territorial arrangements, and cultural consciousness developed over centuries of imperial experience provided the foundation upon which successive political systems would be constructed. The Soviet Union, despite its revolutionary ideology and systematic repudiation of Tsarist tradition, inherited the fundamental challenge that had defined imperial governance: how to maintain unity and purpose across the world's largest territorial state while accommodating the diverse needs of multiple ethnic and religious communities. The centralized administrative apparatus pioneered by Ivan III and systematized by Peter the Great found new expression in Soviet planning institutions that concentrated economic and political decision-making in Moscow, with an efficiency that Tsarist bureaucrats could only have envied. The Communist Party's hierarchical structure, extending from the Kremlin through regional and local organizations to factory cells and collective farms, replicated the top-down authority patterns that had characterized imperial governance since the 15th century. Even the party's claim to represent universal truth through scientific socialism echoed Orthodoxy's traditional role as the spiritual foundation of Russian civilization. The territorial integrity maintained through 3 centuries of imperial expansion survived revolutionary transformation largely intact, as the Soviet Union preserved most of the boundaries established by Tsarist conquest and diplomacy. The incorporation of Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Siberia into a unified state required administrative solutions that built upon imperial precedents, adapting traditional methods of indirect rule and cultural accommodation to new ideological requirements. The fiction of Soviet federalism, with its elaborate structure of union republics and autonomous regions, provided symbolic recognition of ethnic diversity while maintaining practical centralization in ways that would have been familiar to 19th century governors. General, the cultural patterns established during the imperial period proved remarkably resilient to revolutionary transformation. Russian language remained the lingua franca of inter-ethnic communication. Orthodox architectural and artistic traditions influenced Soviet aesthetic development despite official atheism, and the intellectual frameworks developed by imperial-era writers and thinkers continued to shape Soviet and post-Soviet cultural expression. The tension between European orientation and Eurasian identity that had defined imperial consciousness found new expression in Soviet debates over socialist modernization versus Third World solidarity, while the messianic conviction that Russia possessed a unique historical mission persisted beneath Marxist-Leninist terminology. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 revealed the persistence of imperial legacies with striking clarity, as the Russian Federation inherited not only most of the former empire's territory, but also many of its fundamental challenges. The new Russian state found itself governing a multinational population across 11 time zones, managing relationships with former imperial territories that had become independent states, and attempting to define national identity in ways that acknowledged both European heritage and Asian components. The constitutional arrangements that emerged during the 1990s, with their complex federal structure and strong presidential authority, represented attempts to balance democratic principles with the practical requirements of governing the world's largest country. Contemporary Russian foreign policy continues to reflect imperial precedents in its concern for maintaining influence over neighboring territories, its suspicion of Western encroachment on traditional spheres of interest, and its conviction that Russia deserves recognition as a great power based on historical achievement rather than merely economic capability. The concept of the near abroad former Soviet republics, viewed as naturally within Russia's sphere of influence, echoes earlier imperial assumptions about the organic unity of territories acquired through centuries of expansion and integration. The persistence of centralized authority patterns in post-Soviet Russia demonstrates how deeply imperial administrative traditions had shaped political culture. Despite formal democratic institutions, power continues to flow from Moscow through hierarchical networks that bear striking resemblances to both Tsarist and Soviet precedents. Regional governors, like their imperial predecessors, serve at the pleasure of central authority rather than as independent representatives of local interests, while federal relationships remain asymmetrical arrangements negotiated between Moscow and subordinate territories. Economic development strategies in contemporary Russia reflect imperial legacies in their emphasis on resource extraction, state-directed industrialization, and the use of energy exports to maintain geopolitical influence. The Soviet emphasis on heavy industry and military production built upon imperial foundations established during the 19th century, while current Russian energy policies echo traditional imperial practices of using economic leverage to maintain political influence over neighboring states. Cultural continuities prove even more significant than political or economic legacies, as Russian national identity continues to draw upon symbols, narratives, and values developed during the imperial period. The Orthodox Church has resumed its traditional role as a source of cultural unity and moral authority, while imperial-era literature, music, and art provide the foundation for contemporary Russian cultural expression. The rehabilitation of imperial symbols and historical figures since 1991 reflects popular recognition that pre-revolutionary traditions offer resources for national identity that Soviet ideology could not entirely replace. The challenges facing contemporary Russia: maintaining territorial integrity while accommodating ethnic diversity, balancing European integration with Asian relationships, defining national purpose in a multipolar world. The solutions attempted by current Russian leadership, emphasizing strong central authority, cultural traditionalism, and assertive foreign policy, represent contemporary applications of imperial precedents adapted to modern conditions. Understanding these historical continuities illuminates both the achievements and limitations of Russian imperial development, while providing perspective on contemporary challenges facing the Russian Federation and its neighbors. The imperial legacy represents neither an unqualified success to be restored, nor a historical burden to be entirely rejected, but rather a complex inheritance that continues to influence political possibilities and cultural expression in ways that transcend ideological preferences or constitutional arrangements. Across the vast expanse of the Eurasian steppe, where winter winds still whisper through ancient birch forests and summer light lingers impossibly long over the tundra, the echoes of imperial grandeur fade into the eternal rhythms that preceded and will outlast all human institutions. The Russian Empire, that magnificent and tragic experiment in governing 1/6 of the world's land surface, has dissolved into history like morning mist rising from the Volga. Yet its essential patterns remain woven into the landscape, where empires rise and fall according to laws as immutable as seasonal change. We began this long journey through time in contemplation of how human societies emerge from the intersection of geography, culture, and circumstance, growing organically from the soil of particular places while reaching toward universal aspirations that transcend their origins. The Slavic traders who first navigated the river routes between Baltic and Black Seas could not have imagined that their modest commercial ventures would evolve into a continental empire stretching from Warsaw to Vladivostok. Yet the seeds of that expansion lay embedded in their initial response to the challenges and opportunities presented by the great Eurasian landmass. The story we have traced reveals how civilizations, like living organisms, develop according to their internal logic while adapting to external pressures, achieving remarkable coherence across centuries of change, while ultimately yielding to forces they cannot control or accommodate. The Russian Empire's trajectory from medieval principality to modern great power illustrates both the possibilities and limitations inherent in all human attempts to create lasting institutional arrangements. demonstrating how even the most successful societies carry within themselves the contradictions that will eventually necessitate their transformation. The suffering and tragedy that marked the empire's final decades remind us that historical change, however inevitable in retrospect, exacts human costs that statistics cannot capture and philosophy cannot fully rationalize. Yet the cultural achievements that emerged from imperial experience, the literature that illuminates universal human experience, the music that speaks across linguistic boundaries, the architectural monuments that inspire wonder centuries after their creation, suggests that civilizations, even in their dissolution, contribute to the ongoing human conversation that transcends political arrangements. As we settle into the gentle embrace of sleep, carrying with us the wisdom gained from witnessing how human societies navigate the eternal challenges of power and purpose, tradition and innovation, we find consolation in recognizing that the deepest currents of human experience flow beneath the surface turbulence of political events. The forests still whisper their ancient secrets, the rivers continue their patient journey toward the sea, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, new dreams of human possibility are taking shape, waiting for their moment to emerge into the light of history.